There are so many reasons not to forgive. If you have been harmed by someone, if there is somebody that remains unforgiven in your life, you already know this. Perhaps even hearing the word forgiveness raises your hackles and alerts your defenses and causes you to start making a mental list of the reasons why the person does not deserve to be forgiven. And the answer is yes, they don't deserve to be forgiven, because that is the very nature of forgiveness. To go before and give grace. To give grace before it is deserved or earned, often before it is asked for. One reason on the list of reasons not to forgive that people often cite is the other person's lack of apology, repentance, or remorse. Another reason is that in our minds, from the view of somebody who's been harmed, the person who harmed us is unworthy of forgiveness. Why would we give grace to someone who has hurt us? To an unremorseful someone? To someone whose harm towards us might have changed the entire trajectory of our lives, or wounded us so deeply that decades later the scars still sting? I want to remind us, because we read the first half of this story last week, of what Joseph's brothers did to him. If you missed last week, or you were here in body but not spirit, which I totally understand sometimes, especially when it's hot, I'll often offer a little bit of backstory to where we find Joseph and his brothers today. Joseph's brothers, out of jealousy for the love that Jacob, their father, had for Joseph, plot to kill him. One brother out of the 12, Reuben, has qualms with the plan, so the brothers decide to throw Joseph into a cistern instead. But then they realize there's no profit to them if he's just sitting in a cistern. So what is a better idea? They're going to sell their brother into enslavement. As an interesting note, the brothers sell Joseph to the Ishmaelites, descendants of Ishmael, brother to Isaac, whom Abraham and Sarah cast into the desert to die. We read the story of Hagar and Ishmael and how God redeemed them, and now just 2 generations later, we see the estrangement between the families that started back when Abraham and Sarah trespassed against Hagar and Ishmael. And so even though God redeemed Hagar and Ishmael, we see that the human strife is not yet gone. One of our themes throughout this series has been both the trauma that can be passed from one generation to the next, as we've read about this foundational family in the faith, in actually 3 faiths. And we've also talked about, in addition to generation that can be or trauma that can be passed from generation to generation, how the presence of God can work generation to generation through our humanity to redeem and restore. I think we really want these 2 things to be separate. Right? Broken families, harm caused to others, selfishness, jealousy, pettiness, cruelty, control issues, power grabs. We want those over here. And love, grace, forgiveness, redemption, healing, new life, hope over here. And never shall the 2 meet. Right? Isn't that why we struggle sometimes so much when harm is done by the church? But this is not the nature of life. What happens in one generation impacts the next and the next and the next. And what happens over here, those grabs for power or jealousy or all of those things, somehow intermingle with God's plans and God's will, with that love and the grace and the forgiveness. Perhaps if Sarah and Abraham had not cast out Hagar and Ishmael, this group of Ishmaelites would have come upon Joseph and his brothers and recognized kin. Instead of buying Joseph, maybe they would have said, "Cousin, come join our group because your brothers don't want you anymore. We are, after all, family." But generations ago, strife was sown in this family, not just through Abraham and Sarah's actions, but it continued one generation after the next, through the deceit of Jacob and his mother Rebekah to trick Esau and Isaac, through the deceit of Laban, who tricks Jacob into marrying Leah, a woman he does not love, which leads directly to Jacob's favoritism of his wife Rachel's son Joseph, which then causes Joseph's brothers, who are mainly from the wife Leah, to be jealous of the love that Jacob has. On and on, the cycle of trauma churns through this family, generation after generation, until we find this moment where Joseph has a choice to continue the trauma through yet another generation or restore peace in this family through forgiveness of his brothers. For a moment, I'm going to ask you to sit with trauma that you might have inherited from your family, however you define family. It might be your church family, it might be your biological family, it might be your chosen family. Just for a moment, sit with it. What has been passed down to you from generation to generation? Cup your hands for a moment and hold it, whatever it is. Is it heavy in your hands? Does it weigh you down? Does it have a texture or a color? Now, begin to envision the people in your family who also carry this burden. I suspect that you are not alone. Who is also holding this trauma along with you? Who handed it down to you? And who is standing to inherit it from you? For a moment, let it go. We'll revisit it in a little bit. These are sobering thoughts, are they not? To think that we might have inherited harm from past generations and that we might pass it on to future generations. Sometimes it feels inevitable, doesn't it, that the cycles of trauma will continue. Forgiveness feels impossible and like too much to ask. When we have been harmed and when our harm comes at the hands of others who have been harmed, when trauma piles upon trauma, why should we be the ones to bear the burden of forgiveness? But what if we envisioned forgiveness as something other than a burden? What if, in fact, it was the setting down of a burden, a releasing of what binds us, and a releasing of what might bind future generations? In our highly individualistic American culture, we tend to frame forgiveness as an individual act. We forgive the person who has harmed us. It is between us and them. We don't count the costs of the harm to others or the blessing that can come to ourselves, our family, our communities, perhaps even the world, if we step into forgiveness. How many wars have been fought over what started as a family conflict, a tribal conflict, a conflict between two people in power that ended up involving nations, thousands of people and families who are inheritors for generations of the trauma that might have started as a conflict between a small contingent of people. Forgiveness, though, also has the same power to build into a life-giving force that blesses beyond measure. Joseph forgives his brothers for the personal trespass of selling him into enslavement. And this action leads to his brothers coming under Joseph's protection during a famine, which preserves the life of a people, of a nation, 4 generations. The descendants of Jacob will flourish in Goshen, and it begins here with this act of forgiveness from Joseph to his brothers. Forgiveness is not fair. I want to name that again. It is not fair that Joseph bears the burden of forgiving when it was his brothers that have wronged him. He has been harmed, and yet the work of forgiveness is his to do. It's like we are harmed and traumatized, and then we still have that hard, difficult, emotional work to step into forgiveness. It's a double burden, a double portion. And the story does not ignore Joseph's anguish or pain. We didn't read that part of the story here in worship, but if you read the chapters preceding the scene of forgiveness, Joseph tests his brothers, Joseph sobs, Joseph first appears as harsh and unyielding, he imprisons his brothers before coming to the scene of forgiveness and restoration. The Bible does not treat forgiveness as easy or without cost. If you are finding yourself in a place where forgiveness seems impossible, the harm too great, the burden too heavy, I encourage you to read Genesis chapters 42 through 45. Travel with Joseph through his anguish, his bargaining, his testing of his brothers. And I think you might find your own pain in those pages. It is true that the call to forgiveness can feel like its own burden, one more harm piled on top of a stack of harm, one more weight to carry in the face of the harm of trauma. But through forgiveness, we have the power to set ourselves free, to end the trauma cycle, and perhaps to free generations to come. Forgiveness empowers us to write our own story and to reclaim our agency, to unbind and unburden ourselves from the trauma and the pain. Forgiveness does not mean that things will be as they were. They will never be as they were before the event that causes us to need to look at forgiveness. But it does mean, forgiveness does give us the opportunity for the hope of a new day dawning. Imagine, again, in your cupped hands, that which might need to be forgiven in your own life, in your own family, in your own community. For just a moment, take a deep breath and just release your grip on it for a moment. Breathe a breath prayer for the person who caused you harm, and just for a moment, perhaps, ask God to bless them as Joseph's brothers are blessed through his actions. Rest in this space for a beat if you can. And if you can't even begin to loosen your grip on the pain, invite God into the space to hold it for you. What does it feel like? Do you find a sense of release? Just a pause maybe in the pain? God does not abandon us to forgive on our own. Joseph tells his brothers, what you intended for harm, God intended for good. God redeemed the actions of Joseph's brothers by allowing Joseph to find a home in Egypt, to become powerful in the court of Pharaoh, which gives Joseph the power to interpret the dreams that God has sent him for the good of the Egyptian people and for the Israelites. We don't always find these kinds of blessings out of the harm that has been caused to us, but often when we look, we can see the hand of God redeeming what someone else meant for harm. Taking events that were nothing but horrific, God can weave a story of redemption and hope and even new life. Forgiveness does not ignore the harm that was done. In fact, forgiveness is not necessary if there has not been harm. Right? So I want to say this again because this is sometimes such a stumbling block to forgiveness. Forgiveness does not ignore the harm that was done. If there was no harm, there would be no need for forgiveness. Right? In fact, forgiveness acknowledges the harm. It says it was real and it did damage. But it says there can be something after the damage. Accountability is woven into the very fabric of forgiveness, but it's not all that is there. Joseph names that his brothers meant him harm. Even though he says God might have redeemed their sin, he says what you meant for harm. He doesn't let them off the hook. He doesn't say because God used this for good, it means that your intentions were good. He says what you meant for harm, you, brothers, have harmed me. There is accountability. God has taken and used for good. God was the agent of redemption here. And so God might have redeemed their sin, but there is no denying that they sold him into slavery and lied to Jacob about the fate of his son. I think so often, just as we do not want to we don't want to intermingle sin over here and power and control and jealousy with love, hope, grace, and forgiveness. So too, we don't want to talk about forgiveness and trespasses in the same sentence. What we're really looking for is an excuse. Oh, it's no big deal what you did to me. That's not forgiveness. That's an excuse for the other person. Forgiveness is a deep intermingling of the two things, both the harm and the sin and the trespasses of humanity and the grace and the love and the redemption of God that comes in and can make what was meant for harm into something good. You can't have forgiveness if there hasn't been a trespass. So, too, we see in this story of this family, starting with Abraham and Sarah, that God's will is lived out through broken human beings. I don't know that I want to say that you can't have God's redemption without human sin, but certainly this is the plan that God has somehow for our creation, is that we will live fully human, and that means we'll mess up and we'll harm other people, and we are finite, so we will be harmed as well. And at the same time, somehow, God's redemption is mixed into that and covers that and takes what was meant for harm and turns it to good in a holy mystery that I think defies understanding. And maybe this is why forgiveness is so hard, because logically, forgiveness doesn't make sense. It is not fair. I've raised 3 kids. I know the importance of fairness, right? It is not fair. I know. It is not fair. And yet, somehow, this is how God works in our world. And out of this thing that is not fair, this call to forgive, God can make something beautiful. Because forgiveness releases the harm, it sets down the burden, it unbinds the chains, and it begins to tell the next chapter of the story. It stops the cycle of trauma and invites the next generation to live into a different narrative. What began with the trespasses of Abraham and Sarah in this story, the trauma that has been handed down from generation to generation, comes to an end, at least for a while here. For generations, the people will now thrive. Joseph gives them an inheritance of life, of family, of love of God and each other. The legacy will persevere and preserve the people until a Pharaoh comes to power who does not remember Joseph. The legacy that Joseph leaves to his people is one of life. Forgiveness is ours to give, but it is never ours alone in terms of the blessings it reaps. God began by calling Abraham and reiterated to Jacob, your inheritance is to be blessed to bless others. All of the nations of the earth shall be blessed in you. Perhaps the power to forgive is not so much a burden as it is a blessing. One meant not exclusively for us, but to bless all the nations of the earth. Grip one last time in your hands that which has harmed you. And ask, do you want to pass this on to the next generation? Is this the inheritance that you want to give to those who come after you? Whether you're thinking about your kids or your grandkids or your great-grandkids or the people who will sit in these pews 50 years from now, is what you grip in your hand the legacy you want to leave them? Or do you want to give the gift of freedom, of life and love and redemption? If you want to give that gift of blessing upon blessing, then we have the hard work of forgiveness ahead of us, but we do not go alone. God goes with us. And so as we ask ourselves, what inheritance do we want to pass on generation to generation? If the answer is we want to pass on love of God and love of neighbor and love of enemy, then let us take what we hold on to so tightly and just begin to release it and give it into God's hands so that we and our family and our church and our community and the world can realize the blessing of forgiveness. Amen.